som she jai quan jen karma pa je je dong je je ma je na ren dan zang som pa de ra ma zong Alan ja 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 la nyame rogen do bo ga ja la so one the zoin ga ja Jumban Zeno Nanda Jalo Shenlo Gom Jekam Nora Gon Lai Jajan Me Padam Zender the Nine Jame Gonjan Yegor Shenba Meba Jalo Mege Gomje Gozomba Naender Goy Jebela Mala Jondo Zerwan Debegon Jen Jemen Mege Jewa Jelo Ying me gom jin ge zhe zong ba shi ang zha ran dong me ngo zong ma de ma zhen de ga ra zhong me gong zhen gom zha lo dong zhao wa je lo nam dong ngo wo zhong wo zong ba shi yan ma yen je liang zha Magadul Banjar Gonjan Varande Yerme Domba Jelo Chewa Gondo Yonda Rame Jenjem Palong Jejing Nalan Jeyande Ranzon Doran Je Change Gobanyo Do We left off this morning looking a little bit at gratitude, both gratitude toward those who help us intentionally and those who help us unintentionally. The next thing that I'd like to look at is how we deal with regret. Um, and nobody really wants to hear how they sound. I mean, I shouldn't say that. I don't really want to hear how I sound. I cannot stand hearing recordings of myself. I really don't like seeing videos. Even pictures sometimes can frighten me a little bit. So anyway, regret, of course, is one of the four powers of purification. To regret wrongdoing is considered in the Buddhist tradition an essential element in the prevention of our wrongdoing from ripening into unpleasant karmic results. Equally, we are concerned with inappropriate regret as something that we need to avoid for the same reason that if we regret something that is not a fit cause of regret, then we lessen its power. If it's a negative, if it's a neutral action, then it's merely a cause of unnecessary thinking. But if it's a positive action and we regret it, then we lessen the power or momentum of the positive action and therefore its positive results. Therefore, we find that one of the major infractions of the Bodhisattva vow is one of the four negativities is to cause others to regret anything that is not a fit object of regret. Now, beneficial regret is when we regret having done something that caused harm to ourselves and or others, especially to regret things we have done that have harmed others. And the reason is that, of course, regret is the opposite of rejoicing. When we rejoice in a good deed done by someone else, it's said traditionally we accumulate the same merit as that person. It sounds a little bit like hyperbole to me, but I suppose it depends upon the intensity of one's rejoicing. Certainly, if one rejoices wholeheartedly in a virtuous action undertaken half-heartedly by someone else, then you may accumulate far more merit than the person. There's a story about the Buddha's life and I forget who the characters are in the story, but one of the Buddha's royal patrons sponsored a lunch for the Buddha and his sangha. And apparently at that time, it was the custom at the end of the meal, before the Buddha taught, that he would dedicate the merit, or maybe after he taught, he would dedicate the merit to whoever had the most merit in the assembly. Or at least the way the story goes is when the Buddha was asked to dedicate the merit by the king or prince who had, had the lunch catered, the Buddha is said to have asked the prince, "Shall I dedicate the merit to you as the patron, or to someone who has accumulated greater merit today?" And the prince, or shall I do it to the person who accumulated the most merit today? And the prince assumed that he was also the person who'd accumulated the most merit, and it sounded like a more pious request to make of the Buddha. So he said, "Oh, please, Bhagavat, dedicate the merit, or Bhagavan, I get my cases mixed up. Please dedicate the merit to whoever accumulated the most merit. So the Buddha dedicated the merit of the lunch and the prince's sponsorship of the lunch to an elderly beggar woman who was hanging out outside the gates of the royal enclosure, or wherever the Buddha and the sangha were eating lunch, along with the other beggars who were there because they'd be given scraps at the end of the meal. And when asked why he had done so, he said that the intensity of that beggar's rejoicing in the virtue the prince had accumulated by sponsoring the lunch, donating lunch to the Buddha and the sangha, her intensity in rejoicing far exceeded the intensity of virtuous intention of the prince himself. And therefore, while she had nothing to offer and had offered nothing, she actually, as a witness, accumulated more merit than the prince. So I guess it can really, really work, assuming that the story is accurate. So we have to be careful what we rejoice in, and we have to be careful what we regret. As you know, both His Holiness the 17th Karmapa and elsewhere, I think Thich Nhat Hanh have said, it's important to understand that you're not only rejoicing in the good deeds of others, you should also rejoice in your own good deeds, because that's positive reinforcement in the best and truest sense. What is worthy of regret? As I said, the things that we do that have hurt others and or ourselves. But we have to be careful with distinguishing between regret and guilt. We have an excellent way to distinguish between these. In his Aspiration to Rebirth in Sukhavati, the Gedrup Karma Chame Rinpoche writes, without regret, wrongdoing will not be purified. I therefore regret everything I have ever done wrong as intensely as I would regret having unknowingly drunk poison. Now, this is very important in two ways. First of all, it shows the intensity, that it's a life and death matter. And it is a life and death matter. If I go to my death without having at least regretted the wrong I've done, that's not good. It's better that I have taken the time to review my life, review my actions, and regret the many things I've done wrong. But it's also important in a second way that often does not get enough attention, because this analogy points out clearly the difference between regret and guilt. If by some chain of unfortunate circumstances, this water had turpentine in it, or something that would kill me, a turpentine would probably just make me sick, but let's say it had something horrible in it, something dripped from the roof into the water, or something, and I drank it, thinking it was just bubbly water, and I swallowed it and immediately started to die. I knew that I was going to die. Would I feel guilty? No. Guilt is about blame. Blame is stupid. Therefore, guilt is stupid. Guilt is not helpful. We can use it as a legal term, guilty or innocent. But I wouldn't feel guilty. I would regret. I would wish I had not done it. When we say, I feel guilty, we are saying, I feel as though there is something wrong with me. When we say, I feel regretful, I am saying, at least as I use these words, I feel as though I have done something wrong. Now, the distinction is not simply quibbling. The distinction is very, very important. And this distinction goes to our attitude toward the actions of others as well. In the year 2011, while teaching at KTD, His Holiness the 17th Karmapa, well, he said many things. He said one thing that I remember very, very clearly. And the reason I remember it is because my daughter, at 8 or 9 at the time, was so struck by it and found it so useful as a principle for dealing with others that she reminded me of it. Translators tend to forget what we translate because you're basically operating as a kind of loudspeaker. You're not so much a recording device. You record for you're working on short-term memory, not long-term memory. And what His Holiness said that day was, when someone does something wrong and it makes you angry, if you look at your anger, you're not actually angry at the person. You're angry at what they did. And that distinction is very important. You know, anger is a nicer word, but basically, fundamentally, anger is hatred, isn't it? We don't hate someone who does something wrong. We hate what they did. Now, we may confuse the two, but it's important that we not do so. And that's the difference when we focus that same attitude of outrage or regret on ourselves. That's the difference between guilt and regret. If I drank turpentine or some other worse poison, I would regret having done so. I wouldn't, even if I had the time to think about it, I would not think, therefore I'm a bad person. I'd be a dying person, maybe, but not a bad person. It's just unfortunate. It is regrettable. So I think it's important that we understand the difference between guilt and regret. Similarly, we must learn to distinguish between suffering and its causes. You know the Serenity Prayer. Everybody knows the Serenity Prayer, which was actually invented by an American theologian, Reinhold Niebuhr. It was not invented by 12-step programs, and they'll tell you that if you go to one where they read. And Reinhold, among other things, is to be able to distinguish between the attitude we have to take toward what we can change and the attitude we have to take toward what we cannot change. Similar, does everybody know the Serenity Prayer? It's grant me the courage to change.
God, grant me the serenity.
No, it starts with courage. Yeah. I've been to places where they chant that.
Me too.
Yeah. Well, the way I learned it was, and I'm leaving out the God part, grant me the courage to change what can be changed, the serenity to accept what cannot be changed, and the wisdom to know the difference. You learned it as serenity first and courage after?
I learned, skip the word. Grant me the
serenity first.
Serenity first? Oh,
grant
then
me
it's
the
my
serenity
memory.
To accept the things I cannot change.
The courage
to change
All right.
the things I can.
All right, then I was wrong.
And
I
the
was
wisdom
wrong.
to know the difference.
Did you just look it up?
Yeah.
All right, so I was wrong. Kathy, you were again right. I was again wrong. Well, that would make sense, because otherwise we'd call it the courage prayer, wouldn't we? Yeah, all right. Anyway, that's the Serenity Prayer. So you're asking for three things. You're praying, we would pray to the three jewels. Christians pray to their God. And, but you're asking for three abilities, the serenity to accept what you can't change, the courage to change what you can, assuming that it should be, and the wisdom to know the difference. In Buddhism, This is very much the idea of distinguishing between suffering and its causes. We have to accept suffering. We can't do anything directly about suffering. I mean, we can in some cases. I can take an analgesic if I have a headache. I can take anti-nausea medication if I'm nauseated. But what I cannot do is transform myself from being a human into being a member of a species that never gets headaches and never gets nauseated. What I can do is stop or change the course of my life so that I no longer accumulate causes of suffering. Now, the reason I mention this is because acceptance, which of course is a key word in the Serenity Prayer in its correct order, as Kathy and Naomi have shown us. And it's interesting that I got that wrong. That says something about me, not good. In its correct order, the Serenity Prayer really refers to acceptance first, the serenity to accept, and then courage, and then wisdom. But we need to distinguish between what must be accepted and what must not. We have to accept the fact that 21 people were murdered this past Tuesday in Uvalde, Texas. That's something we cannot change. We do not have to accept the fact that there is no indication of any progress toward real measures that would prevent that from happening again. Now, I'm not going to go into detail about that because, preachers shouldn't get political, and I'm in this seat, I'm a preacher, so. But the implication is we have a responsibility to change what should be changed and can be changed. But we cannot torment ourselves, or should not torment ourselves about what can't be changed. Now, that's hard to do. It's very, very hard not to torment ourselves about what has already happened and done. But that's where serenity comes in. All right. So another thing we need to accept suffering, but not the causes of suffering. We should rebel against causes of suffering. We should turn against ignorance and the kleshas. Another problem we have, and we touched on this a little bit in our earlier discussion, but just to highlight it, is we must, in our cultivation of acceptance, we must learn to overcome the justification of resentment. Whether it's my political resentment of certain things, my personal resentments of other things, there is no justification for resentment because it has no useful purpose. All my resentment does is torment me. And if I act out through my resentment, if my resentment becomes manifest anger, then it becomes a nuisance to others as well. If my resentment is based upon an accurate perception of something that needs to be changed, then I should act, but not act out of the resentment itself. For example, a lot of things that we see in the world may make us angry, and our anger may be understandable. It's understandable that we get angry at injustice. It's understandable that we get angry at unnecessary aggressive actions by individuals or nations. But when we seek to remedy these situations to the extent that our abilities allow us, we must not act out of the anger. The anger may be the unpleasant sensation that has alerted us to an injustice. Although usually we learn about the injustice and then anger is our reaction to it. But when we to act effectively at all in any capacity, we cannot be acting out of anger. We cannot be acting out of resentment. And the reason this needs to be pointed out is because a lot of times in our society, we believe that anger is strength, that anger gives us strength, but it doesn't. Regardless of the course of action indicated in a specific or in a specific situation, it will be pursued far more effectively if not done under the sway of anger or resentment. Just a couple of more things. One thing is that we must accept the need to respect ourselves. Well, we talked about rolling up the poster and the whole Mahayana thing of the dramatic reversal of selfishness. But at the same time, in a real world situation, if we are each of us a being, we are trying to help all beings. That includes us. We are not to engage in the specious martyrdom of excluding ourselves from, our aspiration. The farthest we're allowed to go along that route is to say, may all other beings achieve Buddhahood first and then me. That's legitimate. That's kosher. That's fine. That's extreme bodhicitta. Of the three types, there can king-like bodhicitta, where you say, may I achieve Buddhahood, and based on the abilities I'll have, then bring all beings to that state. Or you can have captain-like bodhicitta, where you say, may I and all beings reach the other shore of awakening simultaneously. Or you can have shepherd-like bodhicitta, where you say, may I bring all other beings to Buddhahood and only afterward achieve it myself. And shepherd-like bodhicitta, because it's the most selfless, is said to be the most powerful. But all three are legitimate. But what you cannot say is, may I bring all beings to Buddhahood and never ever achieve it myself. May I remain miserable forever. There's no Mahayana teaching that I've ever seen or heard of. And I would be very skeptical if anyone told me there was one that says that. And there's a good reason for this. Fundamentally, when we pursue things to the very bottom, the very depths of being, the reason for bodhicitta is Buddha nature. The reason for bodhicitta is that each and every one of us has that, whether we know it or not, as our basic being. It's actually what we are. Everything else is not who we are. That is who and what we are. Therefore, we call that absolute bodhicitta. And it is natural for that to manifest as bodhicitta. It is fulfilling its function when it does that. Therefore, if we don't respect ourselves, we are turning against, in a sense, our own Buddha nature, which renders our respect for others somewhat suspect. Basically, what I wrote, and I thought it was very clever when I wrote it, but it doesn't sound that good now. If we don't respect ourselves, the respect we show others is like the facial expression of a mannequin. And I think that's true. I don't think it's as clever as I did in the middle of the night when I came up with it, but I think it's true. It's fake. it's kind of it's sort of like virtue signaling, where we demonstrate gestures of pious respect for others because we think we're supposed to, and it will get things we want. We'll get along with people and make life easier. It will grease the wheels, so to speak. But it doesn't really mean anything. Respect for others really starts with respect for ourselves, I think. And I don't think it can actually work properly without that. We respect others because unless we are narcissists, we recognize that they are real beings. I guess if we're narcissists, we don't. We just see everybody as kind of like cardboard figures who are accessories to ourselves. I may have that wrong. I've never studied clinical psychology or any kind of psychology. But we respect others because we recognize that they are autonomous beings with feelings just like ours. For that to mean something, we have to respect our own autonomous being, our own feelings as well. I think it's pretty straightforward. And then finally, last but certainly not least, we have to respect our inability to control others. There are things we can control. I mean, I guess this goes back also to the Serenity Prayer. There are things we can control and there are things we can't. We are trying to learn how to control our minds, not in a sense so much of control, but we're trying to give our minds back their power. Thoughts, of course, are merely the mind's display, so it's a mistake to overly dualize between mind and thoughts. But if we temporarily do so, we may say that our thoughts sometimes run us, they control us. And we're trying to learn not to let them do that. We're trying to learn to have the choice, whether to think or not to think. And if we choose to think, whether to let our thoughts continue or whether to stop them cold at any point. These are the abilities, these are the practical skills, among the practical skills we are cultivating here. Choice, the choice to think or not, and if we choose to think, how long to think and when to stop it. We want to be able to, you remember when there were tape recorders with actual moving tapes? And then there'd be crime shows, and on the crime shows, they'd be repaying the tapped phone calls and stuff. And they were always really fast with those buttons. And go back. And when they go back, they would always go back to exactly where they wanted to go back to. When I tried doing that, I tried transcription once. It was terrible at it. I'm so slow. It was just ridiculous. But I had to go back. And then I would go back too far or not far enough. And then I would have to go back again and listen to it again. It was so sloppy. But these people on crime shows, they could just go back. And then they go back and immediately they get right back to where they wanted to get. And then stop. And immediately they stop it. And they can do it again and again. I mean, they have supernatural abilities with their tape recorders, as low tech as those things were. It's kind of like the way when people Jimmy Doors in crime shows or like secret agent movies, it takes them about 2 seconds. They just go up and they're in. Maybe, who knows? I don't know. But so that's what we want to be able to do with our minds. We want freedom, choice. We want to be able to just, okay, I need to think about such and such. Okay, now I don't need to think about that. I'm going to let it go. We need to be able to do that. What we don't want is to be like me, where I find myself thinking about what I don't need to think about, what there is no profit or benefit to anyone in these billion worlds in my thinking about it. And I will think about it again and again and again and again and again and again and again. And then I won't be able to stop. And then I'll stop and then I'll start to go to sleep and then it'll come back and again and again. That's not what we want. we practice meditation so that we don't have to live that way anymore. Because we want our minds to be in charge of themselves. We don't want the thoughts to be in charge of the mind. Thoughts are not wholly other than mind. We can distinguish between the mind and what it thinks, the thinking mind and so on. But we don't want to dualize them, but we do need to distinguish between them. So, so there's that. Okay, Q&A.
Okay. All right. So from yesterday, I forgot one question. So oh, no, she said she didn't want to ask it.
Okay.
Nancy said that her and Zopa really enjoy her teaching.
Oh, good. Nice.
Well, I'm glad I read. I nearly read the question without it.
They used to do that when I was a kid in school. They had these tricks that it was to test whether to test how obedient we were to instructions. They would say, now before you answer any of these questions, please read the entire question sheet to the end. And at the end it would say, do not answer any of the above questions. Return the sheet unmarked to the teacher. And almost none of us, of course, did that, because we all thought we were smart enough not to need to read to the end.
So I'm so guilty of not reading. But anyway, all right, so it's not about me. All right, here's one. When Ellen Bohan, yesterday, you mentioned that your white striped robe is special, but I didn't catch why or how that it is so. Can you explain how it is special, where it came from, and what is its significance?
This type of robe, which is called a zentra or striped zen, is the type of robe that's worn by practitioners of the Vajrayana who are not monastics, that is to say, who are not monks and nuns, particularly in the Nyingma tradition in general, and among Kajupas in the tradition of Barway Dorje. Lama Tratup said, starting with the sons of Terchen Barway Dorje, all practitioners of this tradition who are not monastics have worn this type of zen or shawl.
Also, will there be teaching on rejection, what to abandon?
I wasn't thinking of acceptance in terms of the duality between acceptance and rejection, but I think that we're constantly talking about what to abandon, what to avoid, and so on. So I wasn't planning on doing that specifically. That's it? Anything here?
Really? So, I was listening yesterday kind of off and on, while I was doing the things I did. And I was happy today that you brought up 12-step work, because when I was listening yesterday, first of all, when I saw the topic of acceptance, that sounded like a 12-step topic to me. That was often the topic of meetings. And there was a lot of aspects of things that I've heard you say over years that sound a little bit like program, and then specifically yesterday. And I'm wondering, for me personally, there's going to be a question in here somewhere.
Well, that's fine. We got
But I
all
think
the
we
time
got
in the
time.
world. Yeah, we got time. We got nothing but time.
For me personally, the melding of my 12-step program and Buddhism was life-changing for me. Like I would not have been able to do one without the other. And I know in Columbus, we started 2 12-step groups at the KTC when I was still there.
Yeah.
And we were the meditating peacocks.
But they weren't limited to Buddhists, right? I mean,
Right.
they had to be open to, yeah.
And what it kind of struck me yesterday, and I don't know how much 12-step work you've done or not, which I don't is immaterial, but it sounded a lot to me, and that's why I really identified with it, was a Buddhist lead. You know, because when you're giving a 12-step lead, it's where was I? How did what tools did I use to fix it, and where am I now? And you were using dharma instead of 12 steps. And that was really cool.
Oh, I didn't think of it that way, but
I did, because that's what how my brain works. And I've always, that's been kind of a secret dream of mine, is to be able, because what the 12-step work does that we have trouble doing here is the community and the sharing and the sponsorship. And, you know, Lama Chato, we can't go to Lama Chato with every little drama we have in our lives.
no, but you could do a step 5 with him.
Yeah. But that's also a lot for him to do step 5 with all
It
of
would be a
us.
lot for the translator.
But to do some sort of, you know, in Tibet they do the debating, that when they have...
That's different.
It is.
Debating is intellectual, and which is kind of the opposite of what I'm told. I would not, and were I involved in 12-step work myself, I would not be able to announce it, because it would be breaking anonymity. But I know enough about 12-step work, and I'm not saying I am, but I know enough from reading 12-step literature in a general way to know that, you know, it has to be, I mean, there are so many different versions now of 12-step.
Oh, absolutely.
You know, because they're sprouting, and then they don't always preserve all of the original 12 traditions and things like that. But basically, you know, you can't, if you create a 12-step program, as far as I understand, you can't restrict it to a certain group of people. I've heard of groups where it's designed, you know, like women's groups and men's groups and things like that, and so on. But basically, it's supposed to be open to anyone who has the issues that particular 12-step group wants to deal with and wants to deal with them. So we couldn't, you know, but I think that, you know, Columbus is a fairly large city. Until I first went there, I didn't realize that it was the largest at the time, the largest city in Ohio. I also didn't realize that it had a really cool, you know, counterculture thing happening there. I mean, I knew that Columbus had at one point been the national capital of the Ku Klux Klan. That's all I knew, which it was at one point. So I wasn't expecting it to be as sort of what's the word? Tolerant as it was in places. But so you had enough people that there were presumably people who wanted to do 12-step work, who were comfortable going to the basement of a Buddhist center and doing it there. I don't know that would be the situation up here. I think that that might not have much of a draw up here.
I just wonder if the power of Zoom.
Well, there's always Zoom meetings, I've heard.
So like I said, there's somewhere in there, this was more a negative an idea than a question. But
Sure.
it's been,
Well, that's fine. We got time for ideas.
Question has come in. When we distinguish thoughts from the mind, is it primarily for the purpose of practice?
The answer to that question would have to vary depending upon the type and level of practice the person asking is doing. And it's not appropriate for me to ask them that question. But so I have to be very general. There are times where it is helpful to make fine distinctions. Distinguish between the thinking mind and the mind not thinking, the mind in a state of stillness. Distinguish between those and the awareness that recognizes both of them. And there are times where it's important to recognize that you're not actually talking about three different things or three different minds. So I wouldn't say that it's limited to the context of practice, because ideally everything is practice. I think it's specific to the situation. Especially in the Mahamudra tradition, there's a great deal, there's a vast wealth of different ways of looking at the mind in order to sometimes compare different states, sometimes understand more or experience more about the relationship between the mind and those things we think of as not the mind, such as the body, appearances, and so on. And but again, I don't think I should go further with that in a public. It's funny how, when we talk about thoughts and mind and so on, we chant about it in the lineage prayer, the lineage supplication, and we talk about it. It's actually the most dangerous thing that we talk about. People worry about the iconography, and they worry about the fact that we use ritual daggers and and all these sorts of things and images of various fairly Baroque imagery, let's say, florid imagery. But actually, what we have to be most careful with is not misleading one another or others about how their mind works and how to work with it constructively. Because you can get away from the iconography if you don't like it. You can get away from the language. You can get away from the Dharma Center. You can get away from the brilliant colors if they irritate you. But you can't get away from your own mind. And so we must never say or do anything that could possibly harm someone's relationship with their own mind.
Okay. You recommended an upcoming long this morning. Could you tell us Facebook page or name?
I don't have it, but one member of this sangha posted
I was just
it.
looking for it and I couldn't find it.
It was Lynn posted it.
I know, and I just looked for it and I couldn't find it. but I'll
Yeah,
text.
I saw it also.
You saw it? Yeah.
I just
And
looked her up.
it's disappeared?
Yeah, I'll text
Maybe
her.
it's booked up, or I don't know.
It might be. Maybe it's booked. I don't know.
I'll message her. And
Right, and I'll go on to the next.
Yeah.
All right. Is there a book you could recommend with the stories you've referred to about Manjushri?
Yes.
Oh, and sorry, just before that, Pema, she wrote, it is posted on the Dzogchen page.
Oh, the Barway Dorje Dzogchen. Oh, so that's,
Yeah.
yeah. But maybe someone can post it off that page
Yeah, I
unless
can put it on KPL's social, which is where I thought she posted it, but I
Yeah,
guess
no,
it's
she
on
found
social.
yeah.
Okay,
Sorry,
that's
the
why.
person, but
Okay.
should I
So-
go back to that question?
Well, is there a book you can recommend with the stories I mentioned about Manjushri?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's called, there's a title, there's the ornate title and then the informative title. I think the ornate title is Precious Garland, and the functioning title is The Eight Bodhisattvas or The Eight Great Bodhisattvas. It's published by KDD Publications and also sold in the bookstore here, I think. It's hardcover, and I don't think it's yet online at Dharma EPUB. But it's an odd one?
Yeah.
Okay, well then definitely take off the mask.
Is asking questions during a teaching considered a sign of interest in and respect for the teachings?
It can be. It can be. Although I've heard teachers address this very issue, several of them, and they've commented on a cultural aspect too. That basically in traditional cultures, unless the students are like in retreat, receiving technical guidance on their retreat practices, or they're scholars in training, studying with a scholar. In traditional Buddhist cultures, they say people tend to be too shy to ask questions. In our culture, in the beginning, apparently, teachers have told me that when they first came here, the questions were often very challenging. They were, kind of like, "How dare you say that?" kind of question. I mean, that's a question. How dare you say it? I dare say it because such and such. But so they gradually, the Asian teachers some of the Asian teachers for whom I've interpreted have told me that in this country they regard it as a sign of interest. But they don't make the assumption that those who ask no questions are not interested. There's no downside to not asking a question. The benefit of asking questions, as I've heard many teachers say, is that usually a question that one person has, at least one other person who's either in the room or listening on Zoom or whatever, is also going to have. And so it's usually helpful to others.
And just, she said you posted to Sangha Social.
Lynn did, and I
Yeah.
just put a link on the YouTube too.
Okay, so it's up.
Okay.
So I'm just looking through this between that. No, I think that's it. All right.
Before I pour this, are there more? Before I pour this, are there more questions? Otherwise,
Yes.
oh, okay. Maybe I'll pour half of this, so you don't seem too sure. See, the glass is half full. Actually, it's technically less than half full because it's tapered.
Yeah.
One thing you mentioned was if there's a problem, conflict, resentment, to not harbor that, but to fix it. What approaches would you recommend for a community like this if there's harbored resentment? And
Do you mean if you find yourself harboring resentment?
Or
Because you can't
maybe
know
from-
that somebody else is
from
harboring
both-
resentment.
from both ends. Right, you can't know, but you can know that people don't feel comfortable being in the same room together.
Well, that's definitely that's a sign of something for sure. You know? Well, sometimes people just need space, and sometimes people overcome their resentments on their own. You know, not doing anything is the best first recourse. But if it gets to the point where there's an elephant in the room, isn't that the expression, elephant in the room? Then it depends upon the actual details of the exchange. I mean, if the two people are, while not generally comfortable in one another's presence, are willing to make a special effort to hash it out, then that's a possibility. If that's not possible, then the next recourse would be mediation, if it's serious enough. I mean, if it's just that, you know, for a few days, so-and-so is pissed off with so-and-so because of such and such, you know. But if it's an ongoing situation, then, and doing nothing doesn't resolve it, time doesn't resolve it. And then the next recourse is that the two people get together in a space where both feel equally safe and talk it out. And if they're not willing to do that, or if either one is not willing to do that, then the next step would be mediation.
What's mediation?
Well, mediation is when an objective or outside third person witnesses and listens to both parties, and mediation has different types of situations. There's legal mediation and so on. And a Dharma center would be someone that both parties respect and whose opinion they're willing to listen to, listening to both parties, and really just saying what they hear from both. Because I don't think that a Dharma center is a situation where there can be a decision handed down by a judge or anything like that.
Oh, that's really I kind of have a question.
Okay.
And it has to do with bad habits.
Okay.
I guess like I notice for myself when I like have a bad habit that when I do it, even if I really don't want to do it or whatever, it's usually because I'm feeling really uncomfortable or like really there's something there that I really don't want to face or that I'm not willing to be with. And so then I like distract myself from it. What do you think is like a good way to approach unwanted feelings, even when it's easier to just go with that?
Again, I'm going to talk about myself because as I listened to your question and tried to apply it to my own experience, I find that I have two different types of habits, and I'm not quite sure which type you're talking about. As I mentioned yesterday and have on previous occasions, I have obsessive compulsive disorder. And one of the reasons for that diagnosis, and a diagnosis is just a diagnosis, right? But one of the reasons for that diagnosis is that when I become stressed, or worried about something, I have the habit of trying to bargain with the universe by doing meaningless things. So, for example, I might, and it has to be meaningless. It doesn't count if it actually has any kind of relationship to the thing in question. So, for example, thinking, well, I better keep my phone on, so-and-so's trying to call me or I might miss their call. To me, that's just common sense. It might be neurotic, but it's not true OCD behavior. But if I think, if I don't straighten this, something bad might happen to so-and-so. That's the kind of thing I'm talking about. As though by straightening a text, or in my case, since I like things straight, it would be making it off kilter, because it's got to be unpleasant in my magical system. That cannot possibly influence what happens to somebody who was quite some distance away. But that's the way my mind, my brain functions for various reasons to do with neurotransmitters and all sorts of things. I mean, the chemical things behind such problems are actually quite interesting. So that's one type of bad habit. I don't want to be doing this type of thing, meaningless rituals, but I do them when I become stressed enough that I can't handle, worried enough that I can't handle the stress. And there's nothing I can actually do to control the situation. I cannot accept the lack of control. So I try to tilt the machine. You couldn't possibly know what that really refers to. Tilt the machine, three of us do. There used to be a game called pinball. I'm sure you've heard of it. Yeah. But in the old days, before computer games, and I've played pinball on computer, there were actual tables with little bells and whistles and things in them. And you're supposed to, you shoot the ball, and the idea is to learn the correct amount of force to use so that the ball goes where you want it to and doesn't go down the chute too quickly, and you accumulate a lot of points. But since it is a physical machine, not necessarily moored to the floor of the restaurant or wherever it was, you can occasionally cheat by tilting it or banging it or things like that. So that's the expression, tilt the machine. And that's what I'm, what?
You can't do it too much, because then it...
No, then it, yeah, yeah. See the voice of experience here. So when I engage in OCD rituals, and the term is misleading because they can't be set in stone, they have to involve some kind of sacrifice, like folding the laundry in an uncomfortable or inconvenient way or order and things like that. It's never nice and neat. My OCD is not about niceness and neatness. It's about destruction. So anyway, that is tilting the machine. That is trying to bribe the universe. That's one type of habit. And the other type of habit is self-soothing behaviors that I engage in when I'm worried or stressed. And the reason why I'm making this distinction is you said that I don't want to do, and I want to come back to that phrase. So things, they can, spending an inordinate amount of time reading fiction, just spending more time than is justifiable reading would be one. For some people, it would be watching endless Netflix, but I find most Netflix very stressful, so I can't watch it when I'm already freaking out. Eating, snacking, eating sweets or savories or anything more than I need to, self-soothing, and alcohol, for me. And the reason why I bring this up as distinct from the other type of habit is that self-soothing behaviors, I cannot honestly say I don't want to do them. Because it's always a choice. I always have a choice. I don't have to eat that second slice of cheese. I don't have to eat that spoonful of ice cream. I don't have to drink that whiskey or whatever it is. I don't have to read that extra chapter in the fantasy novel that I'm reading. I do these things. I do them because I'm stressed. I might do them because I'm stressed or lazy or tired. These are all excuses. But I choose. I choose. Each time I choose. Now, is there compulsion in the choice? Only the compulsion of habit, as you bring up. Now, is that the type of thing you're talking about?
Actually, kind of both, I would
Both.
say, but mainly, yeah, that one, like
Self-soothing.
soothing it in a way that ends up just being more draining.
Yeah.
You thought it would like soothe you, but it just.
Well, then learn from experience. That's the answer.
Right.
Like with anger,
Right.
we allow ourselves to we actually choose to get angry. Once we're grown up, it happens so fast we don't see it. But as I mentioned yesterday, I think in our early childhood, we actually, our brains work slowly enough that we can actually see the crossroads, see the choice. And I think it's the same thing with, we learn not to be angry by remembering how unpleasant it is, how it leads to nothing good. Everything that I think was so smart to say or write when I was angry, I discovered afterward was really dumb, hurtful, destructive, not helpful at all. And it's similarly with self-soothing behaviors that end up being more draining than anything else. Just remember that. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. And it's true. I mean, if I read more, if I'm on a break from work and I read longer than I told myself I was going to, the feeling I end up with is bad. I don't enjoy it. It's worse than making myself go back to work. It would be much more pleasant to make myself go back to work. So I think you just have to remember. Any come in?
Yeah, well, I've got two, but I'll do one from email and then I'll go back to the message. If you have anger emotions, would holding the emotion thoughts inside yourself be a bodhisattva act when you compare to releasing the emotional thoughts, and the thoughts might cause pain to other person? Let me read that again.
Anger at emotions?
It's good. If you're having anger emotions,
Oh, okay, anger emotions.
would holding the emotion thoughts inside yourself be a bodhisattva act when compared to releasing the emotion thoughts, and the thoughts being in brackets might cause pain to the other person?
I think the best thing is if you can let go of the anger. I mean, the very best thing is if you can see the true nature of anger, but most people don't seem to be able to do that for a while. If you can let go of the anger, that's the best outcome, the best remedy. Either because you remember what anger is like, that it's unpleasant and leads to undesirable consequences, or because you don't want to hurt others. And if you express it while you're angry, you will probably not be able to clearly express any true grievance you have, anything that needs to be communicated. It's probably going to be overstated or bungled in some way. I'm speaking from my own experience of my own attempts to express myself while angry. On the other hand, holding it inside is not a solution because you're turning yourself into a pressure cooker. And then I used to try to do that, and then I would end up blowing up I'd have all this anger kind of stored up, and I'd blow up at whoever happened to, drop the final straw that broke the camel's back of my patience. And then it was worse than if I sniped at each person who had pissed me off. This one person who probably done very, very little would just get this whole barrage of stored up resentments. So I don't recommend holding on to. I recommend letting go of it. Certainly, the other people don't deserve your anger. They don't deserve for you to unleash your anger on them. But you don't deserve it either. None of us deserve our anger. It's just there. But it's being there doesn't mean we have to hold on to it. We choose to hold on to it, actually, at some point. We are actually holding the anger. Anger is not really sticky of itself. It's slippery. It would be very easy for us to let go of it, but you have to get the hang of doing it. It's a skill. It's an experiential skill, and you have to try it and gradually figure out how to do it.
My glasses are not the most good. What is the title of the book online about elements as deities?
It's not specifically elements as deities, although it does mention that. It's called Establishing Appearances as Divine.
Oh, and somebody's just put that underneath that, yeah. Has Bardor Rinpoche spoken about his long-term vision for KPL?
He didn't speak about it too much to me, but I think he spoke a great deal about it to Lama Yeshe. So you'd have to ask him.
What do you think are the indispensable, sort of essential, foundational Buddhist topics to be educated in?
I mean, the gaps that I spoke of yesterday?
Yeah. And
the things that are mentioned in the Heart Sutra. The Heart Sutra gives a list of topics from form, starting with form, all the way up to omniscience. And I guess it's a set list because we say all things from form up to omniscience. So the aggregates, elements, the 5 aggregates and so on. So all those things that Chenrezig pronounces to be empty in the Heart Sutra, that's a list, I believe, of basic Buddhist topics. So those things, and I believe that Mipam's Gateway to Knowledge deals with them in very much the same sequence. I don't know for sure because I haven't received it all. But yeah, so I would say basically everyone could read Gateway to Knowledge who wants to fill those gaps in knowledge. Not everybody needs to know this stuff, but if you're serious about understanding these mandalas and the symbolic meaning of deities and understanding how purity and impurity work together, fit together or don't fit together, I think it would be a good place to start.
Would you consider maybe?
No,
Okay.
I know I tried. People a long time ago at KTD, the then manager, Miles Deutsch, that gives you an idea how long ago it was, asked me to teach a course on the aggregates using the first chapter of Gateway to Knowledge. And as I mentioned yesterday, the chapters that I've received and taught in retreats and whatnot are the aggregates and interdependence. So I went to Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche, who was then the abbot of KTD, and I said, what do you think? And he said, if you must, you can try, but I tried teaching that many years ago, and people just weren't interested. They got bored. They just weren't interested. So I didn't do it at KTD. And then many years later, but still many years ago, I was asked to teach that chapter on the 5 aggregates in the Albuquerque Karma Texan Children. So I tried to do that. I did that over one weekend, and people were clearly stultified. They were not interested. I think there are a couple of reasons for this. I think that Tibetan Buddhists, by which I mean, Americans, North Americans, whatever, Westerners, Europeans practicing Tibetan Buddhism, are used to teachings as entertainment. We don't want to have to actually work. I think it's probably less so in the Gelugpa and Sakya traditions, even in the West, than it is in our lineages. And there are sanghas within the Kagyu and certainly the Nyingma that are more prone to scholarly investigation. But basically, people want to be, they like the teachings to be entertained. They need a joke every few minutes, and they don't want homework. They don't want lists of the 11 types of imperceptible form. They don't want, they just don't want to know this stuff. They're not interested, and that's their choice. I mean, free country. So I just, teaching this just doesn't. There are two kinds of things that tend to put people to sleep. If the people are nuts about the teacher, the way people at KTD were about Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche, the way we all were about Bardor Rinpoche, then they could teach anything and we'd be fascinated. So Khenpo Karthar Rinpoche was able to actually read out biographies. And, he'd basically read out the biography, and then I'd translate it, and then I would not know what was what, and so I'd ask him, and he'd explain it, and then that would be more interesting than the text. But basically, we were reading books that people could just have read a translation of, and they would put up with that simply because they loved him so much. They were so happy to be in his presence that they didn't care. He could have read a laundry list, and they would have been delighted. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with devotion. But nowadays, things are different. A lot of stuff has been translated. People can read it for themselves. So, if I were to sit here telling you that the organic basis of the ear consciousness is something like a piece of birch bark, which is an example of something from the Gateway to Knowledge, and I were to explain in that it refers to the shape of the ear and the curls and the way that the inner ear works and the drum and the whole thing. Well, you all studied anatomy in high school. You all know what's in the ear better than I do, and you don't need Kinjin Mipam to tell you that the inner ear is shaped like a piece of birch bark. So you're gonna, so why am I sitting here for this? It's lists of things like that. Now, of course, it gets very, very profound, but you've already, once you get to the stuff that people can understand, like of which of the five skandhas is a vow, it's actually part of the skandha form. And the reason for that is it can't be any of the other four. And the skandhas are an all-inclusive list of impure phenomena, so therefore it must be an imperceptible form. By the time you get to that stuff, people are exhausted by the birch bark and the fact that the nose is like a bunch of iron needles or copper needles facing the same way, and that the tongue is like two half moons, or one half moon, I can't remember. People are basically, they don't want to be back in grade school or high school. And by the time you get to imperceptible form, I'm just talking about the form aggregate, which is divided into the causal forms, which are the elements, and the resultant forms, which are the five sense organs and the five objects of the senses, plus imperceptible form. And an example of that, not the only one, is a vow, a promise. By the time you get to imperceptible form, you've lost everybody. They don't give a damn which of the aggregates. They don't ever want to hear the word aggregate again. They're so sick of the aggregates that they would like to buy, targets for archery or whatever weapon they practice that would have the aggregates on them. And, you hit form, you get like 50 points if you, like a dart.
When you say they, you're talking about yourself.
No, I'm talking about people who listen to this and just get like, they actually start to look as though they're drunk. I mean, they get so bored. They're trying to stay awake out of, and they're just. No, you are not. You don't. Are you a bob and weaver?
Uh-huh.
Oh, I've never seen you bob and weave. No, there's bobbing and weaving. I mean, people work hard, and they come to this stuff on their day off, and they have to listen to a laundry list, basically of. So no, I don't think so.
Want to do, or should I do one of them?
Well, let him continue because he's on a riff.
I'm on a riff. I hear that.
Butts are for sitting on.
What I heard you say was, and then also, I think it'll probably. I feel really fortunate to have been briefly exposed to some foundational Buddhism enough,
Right?
Where it's influenced me a little bit, so I at least know that there's such a thing as an aggregate.
Mm-hmm.
Which will probably be lost in the next generation if there's not an effort in some
Well,
way.
no, you know these things because you went to Naropa.
Right.
So people who go to Naropa are the people who want to know these things. Most people don't want to go to Naropa. Right. At some point you have to. I used to be such an ardent advocate of learning the Tibetan language. Partly because, I grew up in a Kala Rinpoche sangha. And in any Kala Rinpoche sangha, at least in those days, if you take refuge today, you'll probably know the alphabet by tomorrow. That's just the way it was. They'll hand you a sheet with the alphabet, because Rinpoche really felt that the previous Kala Rinpoche really felt that the Tibetan language was the necessary basis for the practice of any form of Tibetan Buddhism. And his argument basically were twofold. One was that you all come from highly literate societies. You can learn one language, you can learn another one. And the other one was that his students were from all over the world, especially all over Europe. And if you can't ask people in certain European countries to chant in the language of certain other European countries, that would not go well. Just see that. I'm not naming names. So, it was a practical matter. There needed to be a common language. So we learned Tibetan easily. And then when I began to work at KTD, I was initially quite appalled by the lack of Tibetan language skills. There were people there who had done, in some cases, Ngondro twice over. And then later on, years later, they started doing their 3 retreats and had done 3 retreats and had no practical knowledge of written, forget about spoken, written Tibetan. Those in the retreats, for the most part, learned to make the sounds, but I don't know how much most of them understood. And to me, having learned, Tibetan, functional Tibetan between the ages of 19 and 21, I thought it was easy and people should be willing to do it. But you can't make people do what they don't want to do. And their teachers were not telling them, you need to do this. And so eventually, I resigned myself to the fact that, you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make it drink. Mm-hmm. And many people tried, teaching Tibetan over there, and it just never really stuck because people just didn't feel that they needed to learn it. And so I stopped objecting to it. And similarly, I've come to an understanding that, for one thing, I learned the hard way that most Westerners don't like reading traditional Tibetan manuals. I always thought, if you're willing to listen to teachers talk about this book, wouldn't you also like to read the actual book in translation? And so I was always trying to get the teachers at KTD to teach like the Bodhicharyavatara with commentary, which Bardor Rinpoche did over a series of years, and other long texts, because that's what I like. Mm-hmm. But I was being selfish because I didn't realize that most people don't want that. Mm-hmm. They want to go to a seminar and be entertained by someone they love and respect. Mm-hmm. They want to hear things that are going to make them feel better. Like how much good they're doing by doing Chenrezig meditation, how much good they're doing by doing Ngondro, how much good they're doing by making offerings and so on. Things that make them feel good about things they're already doing. They don't want to have to learn because they're tired, they work hard, they may have traveled all the way from the city, this is their weekend off, and they're just not up for, adult education or so on. They're not, they just don't have the energy, they don't have the interest. So I think we need to resign ourselves to the fact that a certain amount of our community will be people who don't want to learn basic Buddhist stuff. They're quite happy not knowing it, and that's fine. That's not just a New World phenomenon. I mean, there are a lot of people who are very devoted Buddhists in Tibetan society who don't study Buddhism formally. I mean, they pray with real faith, but they don't necessarily, study that much stuff. And so it's really an individual choice, and people need to be allowed to make that choice. We can't tell them, you need to study the skandhas, because people are struggling, in some cases, even with knowing the bare bones practical stuff that's in, like the texts on the preliminaries and so on. And sometimes the mechanics of a practice is all people can stand to learn, and each person's different.
For archival purposes, would you consider
No.
writing
No. It's been written.
It's like something that essentializes the gateway to knowledge?
No. I'm not qualified to write it, and I'm sure there are summaries of Gateway to Knowledge available. I'm sure several Shedras have produced them. I think for archival purposes, we should keep a copy, full edition of Gateway to Knowledge handy. I think we should have these books, on this campus. We should have that. We should have jewels from the treasury. We should have, Mipam's commentaries on just about everything. Anything that's been translated, we should have a copy in the library for people who want to study it. And I think there are certain books that we have here. I noticed a copy of Higher Wisdom or Yeshe Lama. That should be restricted. People should not be allowed to read that if they're not. In fact, nobody should be allowed to read it until they've been taught that specific book, not just the subject of Dzogchen, but that specific book, either by Lama Chotop or a qualified Nyingma teacher. That book has a very strict command seal on it, and that should be honored. Otherwise, we are actually endangering the life of Sanjay Kondo, who translated it. That's serious. That's not stuff to mess with. So that should be placed in we should have secret archives like the Vatican. How exciting. We can be just like the Vatican. Except for the child abuse. We don't.
Yeah. All right, get to Lucinda. So, question about regret. What is the best way to deal with regrets about my relationship with Rinpoche? Now that he's no longer with us, I look back on how I didn't really know what were the best ways to interact with him. I have regrets about missed opportunities. For example, the last time I was at a teaching with him, I didn't even ask for an interview, and now I regret that. Do you have any advice? I miss him so much.
Well, the fact that you miss him so much is proof that you have no cause for regret. I think that we all regret the times we didn't spend more time with Bardor Rinpoche. We always will. That's, I think, very different from regretting our previous wrongdoing. I don't think we did anything wrong. If we failed to take the best, make the best use of Rinpoche's time or our time in relation to him, it's because we weren't able, we weren't ready or able to do so. If we're going to regret that, then we have to regret being sentient beings and not Buddhas, which is appropriate to regret, but that's a big regret. And there's a confession, a line of confession in a 7-branch liturgy in the embodiment of the 3 jewels that says, instead of saying, I confess everything I've ever done wrong, it says, I confess not having recognized my mind to be Buddha. Because that includes everything. So, yes, I regret that I have not recognized my mind to be Buddha. And as part of that, I regret not having spent more time with Bardor Rinpoche, not having known sooner who or what he was, and so forth. But at the same time, we have to rejoice in the opportunity we had to meet him and receive empowerment and teachings from him. And instead of focusing on the regret, I think it's important to remember him with joy. I think that's more important.
I don't know if this is the same as what you asked, but anyway, could you possibly put together a 1-pager that discusses these fundamental topics where we could explore areas of interest?
Many years ago, a learned Khenpo, who originally from, I believe, Raktrul Monastery, and also associated, I believe, perhaps with Chobra Monastery, Khenpo Chajam. So I think I'm not sure if it's Tashi Jeltsen or Tashi Gyamtso, because they always just compartmentalize, they compress it. So it's Khenpo Chögyam. He visited here and was here for some time. I think this was before Lama Chögyam came, but I don't remember. My timelines are all messed up. I remember that he was here at one point when Mingyur Rinpoche was visiting us here, because I remember a conversation that I had with the two of them. But anyway, Khenpo Chögyam did write out a study curriculum for KPL. And at the time, almost none of the books that he mentioned had been translated into English. And now some of them have. For example, the Ninth Karmapa's summary or abbreviation of the Eighth Karmapa's monumental work on the Middle Way has been translated by Tyler Dewar, and is available from, I guess, Natarta Publications, or I don't know who publishes it, but it's called the Karmapa's Middle Way. And that was definitely on there. And I don't remember what else, but it was definitely had gateway to knowledge and all those things. Now, years later, I asked Bardor Rinpoche about the curriculum that Khenpo Chögyam had provided, and Bardor Rinpoche said he felt it was too demanding for most people, that most people would find these books somewhat daunting. I mean, the Karmapa's Middle Way alone, while it's a translation of an abbreviation by the Ninth Karmapa, the Eighth Karmapa's work, is heavy enough that you could, and the pages are very thin, like Bible paper, where it's really, really thin. You could probably get sufficient aerobic exercise just by lifting that book 10 times a day on each side, and you'd probably be pretty good off. And so when people look at a book like that, and its print's not large either, they tend to just run away, which is a shame, because aside from the value of the text itself, the translation involved an incredible amount of hard work well done hard work by the translator. And there are a lot of things like that basically the curriculum that Khenpo Chögyam set out was basically almost like a Shedra, a monastic college, full-time curriculum. And because that's his background. I mean, he was the dean, I believe, of the Shedra at Shaolin, Siddha Rinpoche's monastery. And so I believe he was the academic dean there. And those are the people who need to be writing these things now. I'm not a scholar. I read Tibetan. I speak some Tibetan, and I can translate. I'm a translator, but I'm not a scholar of Buddhism by Buddhist definitions. A Buddhist scholar of our tradition will have received and mastered, at the very least, the 8 great treatises. In the Karmakaju tradition, it's only 8. In most traditions, it's 13. But so at the very least, a person would have to have learned and mastered all 8 of those. And those don't even count preliminary things like gateway to knowledge, the Bodhicharyavatara, all of those, the jewel ornament, all of those are considered preliminary to the actual. So I'm not that. There are Westerners who are that. Karl Brunhutzel is a Khenpo, as is David Karma Chupel. They're Khenpos. They know this stuff, but I'm not.
Well, a suggestion for the Abhidharma teaching, Glimpses of Abhidharma by Lord Trumper, is excellent.
Yeah, it's an excellent book. It's very brief. It's based on a seminar that Trungpa Rinpoche gave. I still think that would be a good place to start. But eventually, if someone really wants to learn the common Abhidharma, then they need to read Jewels from the Treasury, which is, I think, the seventh Karmapa's commentary on the Vasubandhu, or maybe summary of it. To be honest, I haven't read it.
And then, Doug, can we get at least a copy of this curriculum suggestion?
I don't have it. Bardor Rinpoche had it. I don't know who has it now. I saw it. I think I may have translated it. But I was doing it, it was when I was still living at KTD and I was working in what was then I had a desk in the affiliate liaisons office. First a woman named Joanne, and then it was Basha. And I don't know if I have no idea where that would be.
Well, so that's way then.
Oh yeah, no, we're talking about 20, 25 years ago.
Yeah. I mean, basically she did so we can be self-directed. But yeah, I mean, if
you want to be self-directed, read Gateway to Knowledge. Start with volume 1, go all the way up to volume 10. Start with that. And then if you want more, then come back to me. But start with Gateway to Knowledge. Everybody should start with Gateway to Knowledge. They start with Gateway to Knowledge at Rumtek. They start with Gateway to Knowledge in every Nyingma monastery. It's good enough for me. Start with Gateway to Knowledge.
Strange, the video's gone blurred, right?
Yeah.
With my eyes.
What?
The connections.
What?
No, the video is a little blurred.
Oh, that's probably a good thing.
Well, I wasn't sure if it was my
You know,
eyes or...
Wes posted yesterday on Facebook a still from the video of me, and the colors, but the contrast was extreme. So it looked, I guess I was going like this or something, and it looked as though I had like ink all over my hand, but I realized it was just a shadow that was exaggerated by contrast. And when I first saw it, because that's the kind of thing I do. You know, if there were any liquid within 6 feet of me that was dark blue, I guarantee it would be on my hands and arms. That's why I'm getting real finicky now about our new uniforms.
No, I think that's it.
Okay. Anything in the room?
Just thank you, Lama Yeshe, for this great weekend of teachings.
Okay. Shall we close? So please dedicate the virtue of sharing Dharma this weekend to the awakening of all beings, and especially the freedom from all unfortunate rebirths of those who have died recently and may still be in the body. Sunam deye namje zenganye domne nye beranam namje Chengana jambala dromaye simben zole rongwa Gewan de ye jewon kon Senam Yeshe Gyamtso Senam Yeshe Gyamtso Amba Gwen Ye Doma Rinpoche, Maje Banam Jejoje, Jema Nyamba Mebagam, Kone Gondo Dalmajo, Semjen Damje Dedan Denjoje, Ngenro Damje Dando Dombajo, Jangjo Samba Ganda Zajo, Dedan Gwanje Malan Rambajo, Sangye Rinje Zade Dambe Gar, Jangon De Shan Do Ling Pai, Zamje Me Jong Rebu Sangha Je, Si Jin Joda Jambe Da Ju. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Naomi and Davis, for
Thank you.
that's what I do.